notre 12e conférence invitée. Et j'ai le plaisir d'introduire David Klonsky. David is an associate professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia, where he directs the Personality, Emotion, and Behavior Lab. David began his training in the U.S., at the University of Virginia, and then he went on to do a clinical internship at the University of Pittsburgh at the Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic. So as many researchers interested in suicidal behavior, David began his work with personality disorders and particularly with borderline personality disorders, and that's not surprising that he went on to work a lot on self-interest behavior, work for which he's very well known. David, not surprisingly, also won a number of different awards. His work has been recognized by the American Psychological Association, American Association of Suicidology, and can go on and on telling about all the awards that he's got. So his work since then has expanded a little bit and it's not only focused on self-interest suicidal behavior, and today he's going to tell us about the way he perceives suicidal behavior and how he conceptualized this. So join me here to welcome David. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure to see a lot of exciting and impressive talks and to learn what's going on here. Thank you also, Sylvain, for all your help in making the visit happen. I really appreciate that. And lastly, thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Does this advance? So I'll be talking about what I'm referring to as the Ideation-to-Action Framework and also a theory position within the framework. And so I'll start by describing a framework that I think should guide all of suicide research, suicide theory, and prevention. I'll then describe a particular theory of suicide, a new model of suicide that's positioned within this framework, and talk about whether there's evidence that it's accurate and useful and what it means for the field. But a good place to start when introducing a new framework is to address the question, why is there a need for a new framework? Good question. There's a lot of evidence that we're not doing as well as we would like in the field. Suicide remains a top 10 cause of death worldwide. The trajectory of suicide rates in North America depends on your time frame. So in the US, for the last dozen or so years, suicide rates have gone up each and every year, although for the dozen or so years before that, they were going down. So from a 30-ish year perspective, they're about steady. In Canada, suicide rates have been going down in recent years, but if you go back into the 70s, suicide rates today are about the same. So one way to summarize North American data is that over the last 30 or 40 years, we haven't made much of a difference. Suicide rates are about the same. There also is a very important new meta-analysis by Joe Franklin and colleagues where they looked at every study to prospectively predict death by suicide published in the literature since the 1960s. And what they found was not very happy for us. What they found is that the effect sizes of the prediction, the magnitude of prediction reported in the 1960s is the same as the magnitude of prediction in the last 10 years. In other words, our ability to predict suicide today is at a 1960s level. And I think my own perspective is that a very important reason for our limited ability to understand suicide, our limited ability to prevent suicide, is that our knowledge of suicide is limited in a very particular way, and that's the first thing I'm going to try to convince you of. So when we think about oft-cited risk factors for suicide, the traditional list of risk factors for suicide, we think of mental disorders like depression, like anxiety, like substance use disorders, or dual diagnosis, presence of multiple disorders. We also think of things outside diagnostic context, like hopelessness, like impulsivity and aggression, things like that. Maybe I can use the keyboard. Oh, nice. Perfect. And so I'm going to introduce the question, when we think about these different predictors that you see on this slide, what do they actually tell us? And so first I'm going to show you data from the National Comorbidity Survey. This is a large epidemiological study done by Kessler and colleagues in the United States over 15 years ago. And on the left, you'll see a list of clinical disorders. On the right, you'll see something about their predictive ability. What I'll be showing you are odds ratios. So 1 means no relationship, and numbers that deviate from 1 mean a stronger relationship. And the first comparison I'm going to talk about on the right is non-suicidal individuals compared to people who have attempted suicide. And so what we see initially should make sense to you. Disorders like major depression or the presence of any mood disorder, anxiety, substance, other disorders, multiple disorders, all of them have fairly large odds ratios, meaning all of them, if you have any of these, you're much more likely to have attempted suicide as opposed to being someone with no history of suicidality whatsoever. This slide will look at the same disorders but change the comparison that's on the right. Now we're looking at suicide ideators, so people who have felt suicidal but never attempted, compared to people who have never felt suicidal. And we see a similar pattern. Major depression has an odds ratio near 10, a mood disorder near 11. All the odds ratios here well above 2 or well above 1. If we look down at the bottom, multiple disorders, we have an odds ratio of 14. All of this so far, I think, fits with conventional wisdom. But now we're going to switch to a particularly critical comparison on the right. Now we're comparing suicide ideators who have never attempted suicide compared to people who have actually made a suicide attempt. And this comparison is critical, it's certainly critical theoretically. We want to know more than just what tells us about suicidal thoughts. We want to understand the transition to behavior. This is also critical clinically because very often we have people who are presenting with suicide ideation, and a key question is which ideators are at risk for attempting. And yet when we turn to this comparison, this is where our prediction drops. Instead of odds ratios in the double digits, we see odds ratios at or above 1 for all of these disorders, meaning that depression, mood disorder, anxiety, substance disorder, the presence of any disorder, multiple disorders, they tell us little to nothing about the difference between suicide attempters and suicide ideators. This was not lost on the authors of this study, who concluded that all significant risk factors were more strongly related to ideation than to progression from ideation to a plan or to an attempt. And very importantly, this general pattern has been replicated in World Health Organization studies of suicide across more than 20 countries and in both adult and adolescent samples. So we can't ignore this pattern. It's cross-cultural. Now we might think maybe there's something funny about psychiatric diagnoses. What about other kinds of things that matter, such as hopelessness and such as impulsivity and so on? And so we'll take a look at these. And I'm going to show you data from a variety of studies now. On the right, the measure of association, the effect size is now a Cohen's d, and that means that a value of 0 means no relationship, 0.3 small, 0.5 medium, 0.8 and 1 and above large. So when we start comparing people who have attempted suicide to people who have never been suicidal, we see a very large effect of hopelessness. Cohen's d of 0.9, approaching 1. That's large by any standard. If we look at ideators, so no attempters in this analysis, but we look at ideators compared to people who have never been suicidal, we see a similar result, a large medium effect of hopelessness. But when we switch to that critical comparison, attempters are negligibly higher on hopelessness compared to ideators. Even the cutoff for small is 0.3, so 0.2 is close to nothing. Attempters are not distinguished from ideators by having more hopelessness. What about impulsivity, the quintessential trait that's associated with moving from thoughts to action? If we start with the attempters versus non-suicidal, we see a medium effect size, a medium relationship. Ideator versus never suicidal, a similar medium or larger relationship, but we turn to our critical comparison and the prediction drops. And we need to take this very seriously for a few reasons. One is that this has been replicated in multiple studies by multiple labs in multiple samples using multiple measures. And on the bottom there, I have a self-citation. I designed that study to show what I thought was obvious, that attempters would be higher in impulsivity than ideators. And we looked at it in one sample and we got the wrong result. We looked at it in another sample with another measure, and then we got the wrong result again, obviously wrong in quotes. Then as we started to write up our findings, we saw that other investigators had actually found the same thing around the same time that we did. And more than that, if you actually look at, if you start with a sample of suicide attempters, you can classify attempts in different ways by whether the attempt itself was more or less impulsive. You know, how much time elapsed from the idea to attempt to actually acting on it, were there efforts to resist the urge to attempt, things like that. And in studies that look at people who have attempted suicide, they measure how impulsive the attempt was, and then they measure impulsivity as a personality trait. There's no relationship between how impulsive somebody is and the impulsive nature of the attempt they made. So this is something that the field really has to start taking seriously, even though it goes against conventional wisdom. Similar findings with aggression. Attempters are much higher on aggression than people who have never been suicidal. So are ideators, but ideators and attempters are the same on aggression. Here are some meta-analytic data from a meta-analysis we just published this past year. We start with the comparison of ideators versus those who have never been suicidal. And these are, again, Cohen's D's. So we see a large effect for depression severity, a large effect for presence or absence of depressive disorders, and we see a medium effect of hopelessness. But when we switch to the key comparison, ideators versus attempters, depression all but drops out, hopelessness becomes 0. If we focus on recent time frames, we see stronger prediction of people who have recently had ideation compared to people who have never had ideation or attempted. These are Cohen's D's also. If you do social science research and you use Cohen's D as an effect size, you never see effect sizes this large. Depression is astoundingly higher in people who've ideated recently, and current suicidal ideation at the time of the study is much, much higher in people who've ideated in the past year. That makes sense. But even if we stick to a recent time frame, but we switch to our critical comparison, recent ideators versus recent attempters, the prediction once again drops out. These suicide risk factors are not the difference between who considers suicide and who acts. So if we return to this question, what do our traditional risk factors for suicide tell us? They are very good at telling us who develops suicidal ideation, but they are very poor at telling us who acts on suicidal thoughts. And so this is where the Ideation-to-Action Framework comes in. It basically takes this very robust pattern of data over many years, many labs, many different risk factors, many different assessment methods. It takes this pattern seriously and says that there are separate explanations for who develops suicidal ideation as opposed to who progresses from ideation to attempts. These are separate processes with separate explanations, separate predictors. Now, this is a departure from the historical perspectives on suicide. If we look at classic theories of suicide, such as Durkheim's social isolation perspective, Schneidman's focus on psychic or unbearable, overwhelming emotional pain, Baumeister's escape theory, the hopelessness theory, what these have in common is that they more or less treated suicidality as a single phenomenon that required a single explanation. There was a pioneering exception about 10 years ago, Thomas Joiner's interpersonal theory of suicide. And this theory postulated that you need two things to make a potentially lethal suicide attempt. You need both desire for suicide, which mostly but not perfectly overlaps with suicidal ideation, but you also need the capability to make an attempt. And from Joiner's perspective, he specified that desire came from perceived burdensomeness, that you felt like a burden on others, in combination with low belongingness. And that capability to make the attempt came from what he called acquired capability. And the idea here is that it is very hard to make a suicide attempt, even for somebody who feels suicidal, because we are wired evolutionarily, biologically, to fear pain, to fear injury, to fear death. And that is a tremendous barrier, a tremendous obstacle to actually making an attempt. And so Joyner talked about how one can become more capable of overcoming those fear barriers through a variety of ways, but some examples might be exposure to lots of injury or death, or an example I think is a good one is a history of non-suicidal self-injury, whether or not one realizes it. Engaging in non-suicidal self-injury is a way to habituate to self-inflicted violence, to get used to it in a way that most people are not. And so that if somebody is high on capability because they self-injure, or maybe because they binge and purge, or maybe because they not only have a substance disorder, but it's an injection drug, so there's more practice and experience with self-inflicted violence, or maybe they're an emergency room doctor who has lots of exposure to death. Anything that gets you used to, death and injury and things like that will make you more able to attempt from Joyner's perspective. Abuse histories is another example Joyner uses. But what I suggest is that Joyner's major contribution is maybe not the specifics of his theory, but the framework that he utilized, and that should be a framework for all suicide knowledge, for all suicide prevention efforts. And that's what we're using the term Ideation-to-Action Framework. We're trying to argue that this is something that should not just be one person's, a concept used in one person's theory. So this has many implications, and I'm going to focus on one in the essence of time, but I'm going to touch on some others. One is in research design. So if we're designing a study where we want to, let's say, distinguish people who've attempted suicide from some comparison group, it is now clear that we need to in some way account for suicidal ideation. We either need a comparison group of ideators who have not attempted, or we could statistically control for the experience of suicidal ideation. Otherwise, if we just compare attempters to non-attempters or attempters to non-suicidal, we're overlooking the fact that all attempters, or some might argue 99.9% of attempters, are also ideators. And so anything that predicts attempts could actually masquerade as a predictor of attempts when really it's predicting ideation. And in fact, the brief review of the literature that I took us on shows that that's exactly the case for the majority of our risk factors. So one implication of the Ideation-to-Action Framework is research design. We must look at not just what predicts attempts, but what predicts attempts over and above its relationship to ideation. A second has to do with intervention and prevention programs. Any intervention or prevention program should be very thoughtful and very clear about the active ingredients that try to reduce ideation, and the active ingredients and the mechanisms that try to block progression from ideation to attempt. And this is something that can have consequences when not taken into account sufficiently. For example, there was a high school in California where adolescents were attempting suicide, were dying by suicide at a particular railroad. So there was what is sometimes referred to as a cluster or social contagion phenomenon. The school district rallied. They received enhanced funds for suicide prevention, and they put those funds into intense distress management, distress tolerance prevention programs, and the suicides continued. And from my perspective, what they missed is that the most obvious way to intervene was at the action end. Put spotlights up at the railroad, put a fence, put somebody there. That will stop people from attempting. And for reasons that aren't clear yet from this talk, that will save lives, because people make suicide attempts when they're at their peaks of pain and they're at their peaks of hopelessness. If we can get someone to survive the suicidal crisis, there's data suggesting there's well over a 90% survival rate. It's not just that people will find another way. Blocking an attempt saves lives. There's also implications for risk assessment and conceptualization of risk. And so the old way we think about risk is, here's a long list of risk factors. We have mental disorders, depression, hopelessness, impulsivity, access to lethal means. Expertise in lethal means is something that I'll talk about a little bit later, and on and on and on and on. But what the Ideation-to-Action Framework suggests is we need to start thinking about risk for ideation and risk for progression to attempts separately. So ideation risk factors include most mental disorders, depression, hopelessness. It turns out impulsivity belongs there, as counterintuitive as that is. On the action end of things, that's where we need more research here because we have not focused here so much as a field, but that's probably where acquired capability goes. Access to lethal means is something we tend to be good in the field at asking about. That's probably where that goes. Expertise in lethal means, comfort in lethal means is something that I'll argue in a bit has not gotten enough attention and matters more than we think. Social contagion, from my perspective, is an action risk factor in that, to use this high school as an example, if we imagine that there are many adolescents in distress or feeling suicidal, a big barrier is, could I actually make the attempt? What would that look like? Is that even possible? And when you see, or when you learn that people just like you have died by suicide using a particular method that you have access to, that suddenly increases one's perception that, oh, I could do that too. So I see social contagion as an action risk factor. Some risk factors will increase risk for both ideation and progression to attempts. And I gave the example earlier of non-suicidal self-injury. Well, self-injury is both a marker of increased distress because it is most often used to cope with overwhelming negative emotions and to obtain some sense of temporary relief, although there's many other motivations as well. But as I noted, self-injury is also a way where people habituate to self-inflicted violence. So even though many self-injurers are not actively suicidal, they don't feel suicidal, some do, but some don't, should someone who self-injures start feeling suicidal, they're at much greater risk of acting on that ideation because they in a sense have a head start on being capable of making a suicide attempt. So some risk factors will be what sometimes a friend of mine calls double trouble risk factors. All right, so that is the framework.